Welcome to my channel. Grandma's advices, it was the kind of quiet life many envy. Our home in Eastern America was tucked between maple-lined streets and silent cul-de-sacs where time seemed to move slower than everywhere else. David, my husband, provided well. He was organized, structured, a man of few words, but dependable. And me, I was the classic picture of a suburban wife, loyal, soft-spoken, maybe a little too trusting. Jerome entered our lives quietly, almost invisibly. A recommendation from David's colleague. They said he was respectful and hardworking, young, barely in his 20s, but with the kind of manners that came from hard living and humility. He moved in, and slowly the rhythm of our home changed in the smallest ways. He never spoke unless spoken to, always on time. Clothes folded so neatly, it made the closets look like department store displays. At first, I didn't pay much attention. David was always out early in late work deadlines meetings. He said the same things every night. It's just a busy season. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I had no reason to doubt him. Jerome, though, became part of my everyday. He didn't just clean, he noticed. When I had a headache, he made mint tea. When I dropped a photo frame, he fixed it before I even realized it was cracked. He moved through the house like a shadow that cared. And in his quiet, there was something almost poetic, an awareness that made him feel much older than he was. We started talking more during the days out. Nothing inappropriate, just shared moments, books we'd read, meals we liked, stories from our childhoods. His came with pain, poverty, rejection, a mother who worked 3 jobs and still went hungry. He spoke with no self-pity, just facts. The more he shared, the more I listened. And the more I listened, the more I noticed things I hadn't before, like how David never looked Jerome in the eye, how his tone changed around him. I thought it was awkwardness or just cultural discomfort. I shrugged it off, but the air had started to shift. I'd enter a room and find them sitting in silence, not talking, just staring in opposite directions. Once I saw David hand Jerome a wrapped gift, a silver watch. "He's doing a good job," he said flatly when I asked. That night, Jerome didn't wear it. Little things began to form a puzzle that didn't make sense. Jerome would flinch slightly when David called his name. Once I found him standing alone in the kitchen long after his chores were done, staring at nothing, his hands clenched like he was holding in something that might crack him open. There was no storm yet, but the sky had started to turn. I couldn't name it. I didn't want to. But something about our peaceful home was no longer peaceful, and I was no longer sure what I wanted to believe, that I started paying attention, not out of suspicion, but instinct. A woman knows when something shifts. David became overly kind to Jerome in a way that didn't fit his usual stiffness. He offered compliments casually, even touched his shoulder once in passing. I'd never seen him that comfortable with anyone, not even with me. It wasn't obvious, but it was there in the way people move. Pause, avoid, or overcompensate. Jerome, on the other hand, began pulling away. He no longer lingered after finishing his tasks. Conversations shortened, smiles faded. He avoided my gaze like it burned him. The warmth I once saw in him had turned cold, like he was carrying a secret that was too heavy for his shoulders. One rainy afternoon, David left for a weekend conference. I stayed home with a book I'd read before, and a silence that filled the house too quickly. Jerome brought me tea without being asked, and for the first time in weeks we talked. He seemed lighter, almost like his old self. I asked about his dreams, what he wanted from life. His eyes lit up when he spoke about studying literature, opening a small cafe, maybe even writing one day. He had a poetic soul hiding behind his silence. I listened longer than I should have. That night, I dreamt of him not in a sinful way, but in an emotional closeness I hadn't felt in years. I saw us sitting together, laughing, the sound of peace between us. I woke up confused and ashamed. I was married. I loved David. Or at least I had before life thinned our bond into daily routines and distant conversations. The next morning, David called and asked about Jerome. Not about the house, not about me, but Jerome. "He's doing okay, right? He's not planning to leave." His voice carried a nervous energy. I gave a vague answer. Why would Jerome leave? He had stability here. But when I mentioned the call to Jerome later, his face went blank, he nodded, said nothing, and left the room. The following week, I found something strange. David's old cologne, one he hadn't worn in years, placed inside Jerome's laundry basket. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, but mistakes don't come wrapped in silk handkerchiefs. I started remembering things I'd ignored. The long talks David used to have behind closed doors, the whispered instructions, the new clothes he bought for Jerome saying the old ones were too basic. Once David offered to take Jerome shopping himself, just the two of them. When I asked to join, he said, "It's not necessary." Jerome stopped making eye contact altogether. The boy who once shared childhood stories now moved like a ghost through the house. I wasn't just being paranoid. There was something unfolding quietly, and I was the only one pretending not to see it. There's a difference between doubt and intuition, and mine was no longer silent. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the truth came crashing through everything. I thought I knew. I came home early from a friend's lunch, unannounced the way you do when you're simply tired and craving your own space. The house was quiet, not suspiciously, so just still, until I heard voices hushed too soft to catch all the words, but tense enough to make my steps freeze. I moved closer, heart pounding. David's voice, then Jerome's. The tone wasn't confrontational, it was something else, intimate, strained, almost emotional. My breath caught when I heard David say, "I don't care what anyone thinks. I need you to stay with me." There was no anger in his voice, only desperation. Silence followed. I couldn't move. I didn't want to understand what I was understanding. Then Jerome spoke low and trembling. "This isn't right. You're married. She trusts both of us." It was like something inside me cracked. I wasn't prepared. Not for this. I had braced for many things. Maybe another woman, maybe David hiding a financial problem. But this, I walked away numb. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream. I just sat in the empty guest room, heart-frozen questions spinning faster than answers. How long? Why him? What did I miss? What did I ignore? Jerome found me hours later. He looked broken, not afraid, just ashamed. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He just stood there and said, "I never wanted this to happen. I didn't look for it." He saw something in me. I didn't even see in myself. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My world had shifted in a way that crying couldn't fix. I looked at him and saw someone who didn't plan to betray, but got swept into something forbidden. And yet betrayal doesn't need intent. It only needs silence. And he'd been silent too long. I didn't see David that night. He didn't come to me. I suppose he assumed the damage was done, that words would only scrape the wound wider. Maybe he didn't know what to say, or maybe he'd already said everything to Jerome that should have been mine. I replayed moments in my head with new meaning. The watch, the glances, the change in behavior. It was all there, dressed up as loyalty disguised as respect. What haunted me more than the betrayal was that I had been erased from the story while it was still being written inside my own home. My marriage had become background noise to a new connection I wasn't even invited to witness. This wasn't just infidelity, it was emotional abandonment, and it wasn't just a scandal. It was a rupture of trust. One didn't know how to repair. I was no longer wondering if they had feelings for each other. I knew they did. And somehow I wasn't angry. I was disappointed in both of them and in myself for not seeing it sooner. When I finally sat down with David, there was no yelling, no emotional outburst. I had rehearsed fury, but when I looked at him, all I saw was a stranger who once wore my husband's face. He didn't try to deny anything. In fact, he looked relieved that the weight had finally fallen out into the open. I didn't plan it. He said it started with conversations. He listened. I didn't feel judged. You and I stopped being us a long time ago, Sarah. I stayed quiet because part of that hurt more than the affair itself. How easily we both slipped into emotional distance. How long we've been living side by side like polite roommates. Jerome left the next day. No goodbyes, just a folded letter left on the kitchen table. In it, he apologized not just for what happened, but for breaking the quiet peace of a home that gave him a second chance at dignity. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't excuse anything. He wrote, "Love in its truest form should never destroy." I sat with that sentence longer than anything else. It rang louder than David's explanations, louder than the silence that filled the rooms afterward. Jerome had been caught between affection and morality, and in the end, he chose to walk away. Not fight for something that was born of betrayal. David and I decided to separate. It wasn't war, it was tired acceptance. He said he still cared for me, just not in the way a husband should. I nodded. I understood more than I wanted to. It hurt, but some truths are cleaner than lies. We didn't scream. We signed papers. We split furniture. We let go. Friends asked if I hated him. I didn't. I hated the situation. The silence, the way something so intimate could grow in the shadows of my own home, without me seeing it. But hatred, no. That would have meant I still felt something strong enough to burn. I didn't. I felt quiet, hollow but not empty. Not anymore. I started reading again. Long walks became therapy. I traveled places I'd talked about for years but never prioritized. And somewhere along the way, I started healing. Not because the pain vanished, but because I allowed myself to feel it fully, without trying to cover it up with explanations or blame. What happened in my home wasn't just a scandal, it was a wake up call to stop sleepwalking through love, to ask harder questions, to pay closer attention, and to understand that betrayal doesn't always arrive with cruelty. Sometimes it comes dressed in need and loneliness, in things we don't talk about until it's too late. Love is a choice, not a guarantee, and trust that's the foundation. When it's gone, everything else is decoration on a crumbling wall. In the end, I don't tell this story to seek sympathy. I tell it because someone out there is ignoring the silence, brushing off the instincts, refusing to ask the questions. I hope they ask them now before the truth answers for them.